Chapter 9. Outside the curved transparent steel canopy came one last burst of bubbles from the blue-veined rock formation rising from the ocean floor. As if that had been a signal, the blaze lights illuminating the area began to dim. The quiet buzz of conversation in the observation gallery stopped in anticipation. Standing against the back wall, Lando Calrissian smiled in some private anticipation of his own. When he and Tendra Rasant had first proposed this undersea mining operation, her family had been less than enthusiastic, but they had been openly critical of his idea to add an observation gallery so that paying customers could watch. Ridiculous, they had said. No one pays good money to watch miners mining, even aquatic miners in the admittedly unusual locale of the Varn ocean floor. But Lando had insisted, and Tendra had backed him up, and the family's financiers had grudgingly forked over the extra money, which made it that much more of a pleasure to watch packed galleries like this one waiting eagerly for the show. The blaze lights finished their fade, leaving the rock formation just barely visible as a dark shape against the slightly lighter seawater around it. Someone in the gallery murmured to a friend, and suddenly there was a single point of blue-green fire at one edge of the rock. The point grew rapidly, becoming a line, and then a pair of branches, and finally an arachnid web of light as the blue veins of Fracca ignited and burned. And then the sheets of yellow bubbles appeared as the heat of the burning Fracca set off the tertian beneath it, and for perhaps the next 30 seconds the entire formation was surrounded by a twisting fury of fire and light, like a living creature writhing in the silent agony of its death throes. And with a shower of multicolored sparks and one final flurry of bubbles, the formation collapsed into a pile of rocks. Someone gasped, and as the sparks and bubbles faded and the blaze lights began to come up again, there was a ripple of spontaneous applause. The gallery's own lights came back, and with a buzz of excited conversation, the audience began their exit back to the casino areas. Lando waited by the door as they filed out, smiling, accepting compliments, answering a scattering of questions covering the usual range of intelligent to banal, and as the last two Duro filed out, he reset the doorway for general admission. The miners were scheduled to collapse one more ore formation today, but until that time the gallery would be open, free of charge, to anyone who wanted to come in and watch. He was just starting down the corridor towards the trellis room when his comlink beeped. Pulling it out, he thumbed it on. Calrissian. Transmission coming in on the surface link, the voice of Chief Command Officer Donnerwin announced. It's encrypted and marked private. I'll take it in my office, Lando told him, keying off the comlink and changing direction. Tendra, perhaps, calling to say she'd wrapped up her Corellian trip and was heading back to join him. Or maybe it was Senator Myatamia, or another Diamolan official with news about the security arrangements he was hoping to make with them for his ore shipments. Either one would be welcome. Reaching his office, he sealed the door, dropped into his desk chair, and with twice the anticipation those gamblers back in the gallery had shown, he keyed the comm. It wasn't Tendra. It wasn't even Myatamia. Hi, Lando, Han said, an all too familiar half smile on his face. How are things going? A lot better 2 minutes ago than they are now, Lando told him, the anticipation popping like a bubble and settling into the pit of his stomach like a bad feeling. I know that look. What do you want? I need you to go on a little trip with me, Han said. Can you get away for a few days? The feeling in Lando's stomach got a little colder. No who me's. No, what makes you think I want somethings? No banter of any sort. Whatever was going on, Han was deadly serious about it. That depends, he hedged. How dangerous is this little trip likely to be? Again, there should have been some banter. There wasn't. Could be pretty risky, Han admitted. Could be worse than that. Lando grimaced. Han, look, you need to understand. I need you, Lando, Han cut him off. We're on a tight schedule, and I need someone I can trust. You've got the expertise I need. You know the people I need, and there's no one else I can get. Han, I've got responsibilities here, Lando said. I've got a business to run. Card had a business to run too, Han interrupted again. He's not going to like it if you say no. Lando shook his head in resignation. No, Card certainly wouldn't be happy if he passed on this. Not after Lando had single-handedly talked him into heading out to Cathal Sector to try and get an intact copy of the Kamas document from the mysterious George Cardass, whose ties to Card Lando still didn't understand. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Card hadn't wanted to confront Cardass, but he'd gone anyway. Now Han was calling the pot hand, and Lando was about 20 points shy of a 23. All right, he said, but only because of Card. Where and when? Right now, Han said. You have the Lady Luck there? On the surface, yes, Lando told him. I can take the next shuttle up and be there half an hour later. Who are these other people you said we need? Your old admin pal Lobot, for one, Han said. And that Verpine he was working with for a while. What was his name? Mogid, Lando said, feeling his eyes narrowing. And this isn't what I think it is it? It's probably worse, Han conceded. Lobot and Mogid still running that little slicer trick you once told me about? I don't know if they still are, Lando said with a sigh, but I'm sure they still can. You haven't by any chance located... He hesitated. Even with the transmission encrypted, he didn't want to say the name out loud. Obviously, neither did Han. You mean the place we talked about at the Orwood? The other said obliquely. I think so, yeah. Get Lobot and Mogid and meet me 2 systems forward from where you didn't have any choice. Lando smiled tightly. They arrived right before you did, the words echoed accusingly through the memory as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. I had no choice. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, too, Han had replied, as he and Leia, a squad of stormtroopers behind them, had walked forward into that private dining room on Cloud City to face Darth Vader. 2 systems forward it is, he confirmed. I'll be waiting, Han said. The transmission ended. Lando leaned back in his seat, gazing unseeingly at the blank display. The place we talked about at the Orwood. They'd talked about several different places at that clandestine meeting, but only one of them could have gotten Han this riled up. Bastion. The latest site of the oft-moved Imperial capital, its location and name of its host planet hand-sealed secrets. Probably one of the best defended worlds in the galaxy. Certainly the central focus of Imperial power. Most definitely a place where the names Han Solo and Lando Calrissian were rather less than admired. And one of the last places in the galaxy where a complete set of Imperial records would be stored. Records that might have the names and clans of the Bothans who had helped destroy the world of Kamas half a century ago. Records that could end the increasingly violent argument about whether the entire Bothan species should pay the penalty for that handful of anonymous murderers. If they could find that crucial record, and get out with it alive. He keyed the comm. Donnerwin, send a transmission to Lobot at Dive Central, he ordered. Tell him to get himself and the Lady Luck prepped. We're going on a little trip. For a moment he debated ordering Lobot to contact Mogid. Decided against it. The Lady Luck had better encryption than the under-to-over comm, and the less information out there for snoopers to listen to, the better. And get me a seat on the next surface shuttle. Acknowledged, Donnerwood said, unfazed as always by this sudden change in his boss's plans. The shuttle leaves in 20 minutes. Do you want me to hold it? No, I can make it, Lando told him, running a quick mental list. Everything he was likely to need was already aboard the Lady Luck, and barring any major disasters, the casino mining operation should be able to run itself for a while. At least until Tendra got back. A pang of guilt jabbed into him. After all he and Tendra had been through together, she had a right to know why he was dropping everything like this, especially if there was any chance at all that he wouldn't be coming back. He swallowed, his mouth unexpectedly dry. He would come back, all right. Of course he would. Hadn't he flown right into the heart of the second Death Star and lived to tell about it? Sure he had. And he'd survived the destruction of Mount Tantus, and that Corellian unpleasantness, and everything in between. But he was older now, and wiser, with a business he really enjoyed, and a woman who, for possibly the first time in his life, he felt truly and honestly connected to. He didn't want to lose any of it, certainly not by dying. But hey, there was nothing to worry about. He was going with Han, and Han was about the luckiest old scoundrel he'd ever known. They'd come back okay. Sure they would. Guaranteed. Boss? Lando blinked again, snapping out of his private pep talk and focusing on Donnerwin again. What? Will there be anything else? The other asked. No, Lando said, feeling slightly ridiculous. Just keep things running smoothly until Tendra gets back. Donnerwin smiled. Sure thing, boss. Have a good trip. Thanks. Lando keyed off the comm and with a grimace pushed back his chair and stood up. No, there was nothing foolish about a little healthy caution. It was far worse than that. It was age. Lando was starting to feel old, and he didn't like it. Not a bit. So fine. He would go ahead and take this little jaunt into the heart of the Empire. It would do him good, and might just save the New Republic on top of it. Sure, it'd be just like old times. In her earphone came the sound of Calrissian's door opening and closing, and with a sigh, Carolee Dulin pulled the device out of her ear. Shasa, she murmured into the empty air. The words seemed to hang in front of her, there in the tiny utility closet. An old Mistral battle curse, but spoken now not with anger or combat rage, but a deep sadness. Her gamble had paid off, and now she was going to have to kill an old friend. With practiced fingers, she began disassembling the audio tap she'd put into Calrissian's office when she'd arrived here 40 hours ago, a flush of anger intruding on her dour mood. Anger at Talon Card for being so predictable. Anger at herself for anticipating his moves so precisely. Anger at Shada Dukal for putting her in this position in the first place. What in the ashes of Emberline had possessed Shada to defy the 11 that way, she wondered. Loyalty, Shada had said up on that windswept rooftop. That was clearly ridiculous. Mazak was a grubby little smuggler, nothing more, with no more claim on Shada's loyalty than any of the dozens of other employers she'd worked for over the years. True, this particular job had lasted longer than most, but no matter what Mazak might have thought, Shada had still been a Mistral Shadow Guard all that time, ultimately answerable only to the 11 elders of the people. So Shada had defied her orders, and as a result, a Mistral deal with a Hutt crime lord had gone sour, and the 11 were demanding Shada's head. All Mistral had been alerted to watch for her, and several teams had been sent specifically to hunt her down. And out of all that flurry of activity, it had been Carolee who had found her. Even now, 8 days later, the irony of it all was still a bitter taste in Carolee's mouth. She hadn't worked with Shada for 20 years, yet had still managed to anticipate that Shada's next move would be in the direction of the New Republic hierarchy, though whether to join up or sell out, Carolee still didn't know. She'd arrived on Coruscant just in time to see Shada leaving the Imperial City, and had tracked her to an apartment owned by High Counselor Leia Organa Solo and her husband near the Minari Mountains. She might have taken Shada there. Certainly surprise would have been on her side. But the Solos were rumored to have a cadre of Nagri warriors around them at all times, and even given that Nagri combat skills were probably overrated, it would still be risky for a single Mistral to go up against them alone. So she had called for backup, but before they could arrive, Shada had left the building in the company of Talon Card. There again might have been her chance, but before she could do more than infiltrate into the inner landing bay, Organa Solo and her protocol droid had arrived with a pair of Nagri in tow. She and the droid had gone inside, the Nagri taking up positions at the outer hatchway, and when Organa Solo had left a few minutes later, it was without the droid. She'd collected her guards and left the landing bay. And then, to Carolee's chagrin, the wild card had immediately sealed up and taken off, leaving her too far away from her own ship to have any hope of giving chase. The 11 had been furious. So had the Mistral Hunter team, who had dropped everything to rush to Coruscant at her call. Nothing had been said, but then nothing had to be. Their expressions had been enough, and the sideways glances and muttered comments to each other as they'd headed back to their ships. They'd heard the story about Carolee letting Shada escape back at the Resonum Entertainment Complex, and it wasn't hard to guess that many of them were thinking she'd done the same thing here, which had made it that much more important that she prove them wrong. And so she'd played a long shot hunch, keying back on a vague connection between Card and Calrissian that Massac had gotten whiff of a few years back. A hunch that had now paid off. Solo had been careful in that transmission, but that single oblique reference to Card had been all she'd needed. Shada was off with Card, and Calrissian was being asked to join in. And wherever he went, Carolee would be there too. Calrissian had once been a smuggler, and every smuggler, former or otherwise, had a hidey hole or two hidden aboard his personal ship. If Carolee could reach the Lady Luck even a couple of minutes ahead of Calrissian, odds were she could be snugged away out of sight by the time he started up the entry ramp. And if it turned out he was planning to use her hidey hole for something else, well, she would mark that target when she came to it. In the meantime, there was a carry pack to throw together, and a place on the next surface shuttle to reserve, preferably with a seat closer to the exit than Calrissian's. Waiting until the corridor outside was silent, she slipped out of the utility closet and headed at a fast walk back towards her room. "Admiral," Captain Dorsch's voice came from the comm speaker in the secondary command room's inner circle of repeater displays. "The Rurian ambassador's shuttle has just cleared the ship and is headed back to the surface." Handing his drink to Tierce, Flim flashed Disra a smug smile and stepped over to the repeater displays. "Thank you, Captain," he said in that calmly measured Thrawn voice he did so well. "Prepare a course for Bastion, and inform me when the ship is ready." "Yes, sir." The comm unit clicked off. "About time," Disra growled, throwing a glare at Tierce. "If you ask me, we've pushed our luck too hard here already." "We're familiar with your opinion on the topic, thank you," Tierce said, not quite insubordinately, as he handed Flim's drink back to him. "I'll remind you that 3 brand new treaties is a very good return for a week's work." "Only if Coruscant doesn't come down on us like a wounded rancor," Disra countered sourly. "You push them hard enough and long enough, and they will." "This hardly qualifies as pushing, Your Excellency," Flim said. His voice, too, was a little too close to insubordination for Disra's taste. "We haven't opened or provoked any hostilities, and we've gone only where we've been invited. On what possible grounds could Coruscant attack us?" "How about the grounds that a state of war still exists between us?" Disra snapped. "Either of you ever think of that?" "Political suicide," Flim sniffed. "We've been invited by these systems, remember? If Coruscant tries to stick its collective nose in—" He broke off as a shrill whistle sounded from the repeater displays. "What's that?" he demanded. "Emergency battle alert," Tierce said tightly, nearly splashing the rest of Flim's drink onto his pristine white uniform as he shouldered past the con man and dropped into the command chair. "Admiral, get over here," he added, his hands darting over the controls. The tactical display came up, turning the room into a giant holographic combat display, and as it did so, the comm unit twittered. "Admiral, I believe we're about to come under attack," Dorge's voice said calmly. 8 Marauder-class corvettes have just jumped into the system, heading in our direction." Disra consciously unclenched his teeth as he looked around the room for the flashing symbols that would mark the incoming Marauders. Of course Dorje was calm. He thought he had the great Grand Admiral Thrawn aboard his ship, with matters undoubtedly under control. But he didn't, and they weren't. And unless Disra did something fast, this whole tenuous soap bubble was going to blow up right in their faces. Flim was at Tierce's side now, and the Major was reaching for the comm switch. "Tell Dorje he's to take over," Disra hissed towards them. "Tell him this is too small or too trivial for you to bother with." "Shh," Tierce hissed, cutting him off with a glare and a chopping motion of his hand. "Admiral?" "Ready," Flim said, and Tierce tapped the key. "Thank you, Captain," the con man said smoothly, and once again it was suddenly Grand Admiral Thrawn standing in the room. "Have you identified them?" No, sir, not yet, Dorja said. They have random noise generators blanketing their engine IDs. Highly illegal, of course. Of course, Thrawn agreed. Launch a half squadron of prey birds to intercept. Yes, sir. Tierce flipped off the comm unit. Are you crazy? Disra snarled. A half squadron of starfighters against. Calm down, Your Excellency, Flim said, throwing Disra a coolly calculating look. This was one of Thrawn's standard techniques to sniff out an unknown opponent's identity. More to the immediate point, it buys us time, Tierce added, his fingers skating madly across the computer console. Marauder corvettes. Marauder corvettes. Here we go. Mostly used by the corporate sector these days, with a few in assorted outer-rimmed system defense fleets. Interesting, Flim commented, leaning forward to read over his shoulder. What would the corporate sector want with us? I don't know, Tierce said. Disra, any ideas on that one? No, Disra said, pulling out his datapad. No, he didn't know why anyone in the corporate sector might want to attack them this way. But on the other hand, the mention of marauders had triggered a vague memory at the back of his mind. Do you have a list of the other systems who use them? Flim asked. Running it now, Tierce said. Nothing really jumping out at me. There go the prey birds. Disra glanced up to see the marks indicating the starfighters speeding outward towards the distant intruders, then lowered his eyes to his datapad again. It had had something to do with Captain Zothop and the Kavrilhu pirates, he remembered. There, that was the section. I need some suggestions here, Flim said urgently. Thrawn's standard pattern would be to let the prey birds begin to engage, then pull them back, Tierce said. How the enemy responded to the probe was usually enough to let him figure out who they were. That's fine for Thrawn, Flim bit out apprehensively. Unfortunately, we're a little short of his brand of genius at the moment. Unless Major Tierce took classes in the technique with the Royal Guard, Disra added, snapping the datapad closed with a grand sense of triumph. Helpful as always, Your Excellency, Tierce said absently, still sifting through the computer records. Glad you appreciate me, Disra said. They're Diamala. He had the satisfaction of watching both of them turn and look at him, a look of stunned surprise on Flim's face, the same surprise tinged with suspicion on Tierce's. What? Flim asked. They're Diamala, Disra repeated, enjoying the moment to the fullest. About 3 months ago, the Diamalan Commerce Ministry bought 12 Marauder corvettes to use in transport escort, and possibly for some rather shadier operations. You sure? Flim asked, peering at the display. It doesn't show here. I'm sure it doesn't, Disra said. Captain Zothop was trying to buy them and was outbidden. As I said, they may be reserving them for shady operations. And how do you get from there to the assumption that these are those ships? Flim demanded. No, he's right, Tierce put in before Disra could answer. That Diamalan senator we dragged aboard the Relentless with Calrissian. Remember? I never did think he was wholly convinced you were Thrawn. And if our intelligence reports are right, he was the one who helped drive the governmental split on Coruscant over the whole issue, Disra reminded him. Yes, it was, Tierce said, turning back to the computer keyboard. It appears he's decided to give us another test. The question being what we do about it, Flim said, looking across the room. And the prey birds are almost there. I know, Tierce said, gazing at the computer display. Call them back. Already? Disra frowned at the tactical. I thought you needed them to. I don't need anything, Tierce cut him off. Call them back, and have Dorja set up for a Tron Boro maneuver. A what? Disra asked, frowning harder. A somewhat esoteric battle technique, Flim explained, leaning over Tierce's shoulder and tapping the comm unit back on. That will do nicely, Captain, he said smoothly. Recall the prey birds, and prepare the Relentless for a Tron Boro maneuver. Acknowledged, Admiral, Dorja said briskly. Will you be joining me on the bridge? Tierce looked up at Flim and tapped a spot on the computer display. You won't need my assistance, Thrawn assured the captain, nodding acknowledgement to Tierce and leaning closer to read the indicated section. A Tron-Burrow maneuver, followed by a full closure Marg Sabel sweep by the prey birds, and I think our unknown assailants will reconsider their plans. Assuming they're still alive to do so, of course. Yes, sir, the captain said, and Disra could almost see the other rubbing his hands together in anticipation. Tron-Burrow maneuver ready. Execute, Captain. Flim keyed off the comm unit again. And that should be that, he said, leaning casually on the back of the command chair and gazing with interest at the tactical display. You see, we already have a battle plan to use against Nyamala, Tierce explained, looking over at Disra. Thrawn tangled with him a few times during his sweep through the rebellion 10 years ago. He gestured towards the computer. All I had to do was pull up the record of one of those battles. There they go, Flim interrupted him. Running like hopskips. Disra followed his pointing finger. Flim was right. The Marauders were indeed turning tail and heading for hyperspace. But we haven't done anything yet, he protested, feeling slightly bewildered. Sure we have, Tierce said, his voice grimly satisfied. Don't forget, they've got records of Thrawn's victories, too. The Relentless moved into a Tron-Burrow maneuver, and that was all they needed to know. Yes, Flim murmured, as across the room the Marauders' marks winked out as they jumped to hyperspace. With ships that weren't even registered to them, we responded with exactly the right move. He tapped the comm again. Secure from battle formation, Captain, he instructed Dorja, and inform the Rurian government that the threatened attack on their world has been frightened away. At once, Admiral, Dorja's voice came. I'm sure they'll be pleased. Shall we continue course preparations for Bastion? Yes, the con man said. You may leave the system when ready. I shall be meditating if you require me. Yes, sir. Have a good rest, Admiral. Flim keyed off. And that, he added to Disra in tears, is indeed that. If the Diamala weren't convinced before, 5 gets the sabak pot they are now. Good for them, Disra said sourly. You realize, of course, that all this little exercise accomplished was to bring us one step closer to scaring Coruscant into coming down on us. Patience, Your Excellency, Tierce said, keying off the tactical and getting up from the command chair. I'm sure it also helped to convince the Rurians they've chosen the winning side. Yes, Disra said, and perhaps brought us one step closer to the hand of Thrawn. Flim frowned. The hand of Thrawn, he asked cautiously. What's a hand of Thrawn? Tierce pursed his lips, clearly annoyed. Your Excellency. What's a hand of Thrawn? Flim repeated. No, go ahead, Disra said to Tierce, waving a languid hand and preparing to enjoy this moment, too, to its fullest. Tierce and Flim got along together far too well for his liking. It was about time they both got a taste of some of the misgivings and suspicions about this arrangement that Disra himself had been feeling since it started. It's your story. You tell him. I'm listening, Flim said, his voice suddenly dark. What is this you haven't bothered to tell me? Tierce cleared his throat. Calm down, Admiral, he said. It's like this. It was, Disra reflected later, a good thing that the secondary command room was totally soundproofed. As it was, with all the shouting, he completely missed the characteristic deck vibration that marked the Star Destroyer's return to hyperspace. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.